All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to have you here for the next lesson in U.S. history. This one is going to be on what's called the New Frontier and the Great Society, which were two programs and kind of defining of two presidents in the 1960s, and that is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or JFK, and then his vice president, who ultimately became the next president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the time frame of both of those presidents. Obviously, this is the 1960s, which had a lot of activity going on in it. Huge amounts of social, political, geopolitical change happening to the United States, both culturally and politically. And we'll go through most of that here. And then we're going to split off and talk a little bit about counterculture, otherwise known as the hippies and things like that, music. And that'll be separately, as well as will be civil rights, and we'll talk about that separately too. But all of this is happening in the 1960s, so this is one strand of this dealing with what was happening with the presidents at the time. So the first thing that we need to know is that we have a new generation of Americans, that America has changed a lot. Most of this was driven by the baby boom that happened after the Second World War. So all the troops come back in the 1945. They want to move on with their lives. They want to start families. They want to buy homes. They want to get involved in the economy and things like that. And the 50s become a real boom in terms of the economy, but very conservative in terms of culture. And this new generation that's coming up now wants to kind of change that. So this is a group that had done a lot for the United States. They had gotten through the Depression, which was brutal on the country, obviously. They had beaten back fascism in Europe and Japan in World War II. They'd helped to rebuild the world, especially Western Europe, to be democratic in the United States image and become kind of a superpower. They had developed the greatest arms arsenal in the world, nuclear arms arsenal in the world, along with the Soviet Union. And this group of people had become more prosperous, living healthier and longer than ever. And this has actually been called in books the greatest generation. But this is the group of people that really came up through World War II and then wanted to kind of start families in the 50s and 60s, and then their children, also known as the baby boomers. So one of the first things that happened to kind of define the 60s is the presidential election of 1960. And in 1960, we have President Eisenhower leaving office after 2 terms in the 1950s. Kind of an older guy, a general in World War II, obviously a hero, but not that kind of a new ideas guy. He's, everything's good, we should leave it alone, we should just fight communism, and that's enough. JFK, however, is a whole different person. He's young, he's a war hero, he's got a lot of energy, he's attractive, he's got an attractive family. There's a lot of stuff going on here that's kind of new. He's from a very, very prosperous family from Massachusetts. The Kennedys had lived there for a long time. But, they hadn't always been wealthy. They had been wealthy fairly recently, and they were actually known as the nouveau riche, which is the new wealthy. So, they hadn't gone back way into the 17 and 1800s with their wealth. It was something that they had constructed recently. Very active family. They were Catholic. He had attended private schools and had gone to college at Harvard. And he had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and had earned medals for valor and had earned a Purple Heart for being injured in battle. So he's a war hero. So he has a good pedigree, a good resume to become president of the United States. His politics he's a Democrat, and his politics are fairly liberal. If we think about kind of the political spectrum, he's on kind of the left side of that. He's elected to Congress as a Democratic representative for Massachusetts, and he represents that kind of younger, like I said, baby boomer generation, the new adults that kind of are looking for some change. And he believes that government is a good thing and that government should work for the people. So having a big government is okay, and having a big government that is working on making life better for people in the United States is what it should do. He's up against a guy named Richard Milhous Nixon, who ultimately does become president, although not right now. And he's been around for a long time. This is a pretty classical 1940s, 1950s politician. He's from California. He's been the vice president under Eisenhower, and he pushes for a real strong political and economic agenda that's conservative. So he likes the idea of small government, making the government smaller, cutting taxes, working on issues of family values and morality, and he is a hawk, or very strong, on communism. Matter of fact, he was associated with a gentleman that we talked about in the last lesson, and that is Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy, you might remember, is the one who really goes after, and some people would have called it a witch hunt, communists in the U.S. government. And Richard Nixon is associated with him and helps him as a representative from California throughout the House Un-American Activities Committee's trials in the 1950s. He's chosen as Ike's or Eisenhower's vice president and serves for 8 years as the vice president for President Eisenhower. And he's an old guard, so he's the old school conservative Republican. So again, thinking about the political spectrum, he's over there on the right of that. So we have two very different people, with JFK bringing kind of that new feel, and then Nixon being more of a classical conservative. So the election is actually incredibly close, but it's like I said, it's a dichotomy. It's a switch between two very different people, and it's also the very first presidential election that's televised. Now, if we think about the election that just happened recently in 2016, everything any of them did was televised. You know, they moved 3 inches to the left, and that was on CNN. Everything that Trump or that Hillary Clinton said was on the news, but that wasn't the way it was up until 1960. 1960, television is starting to become a medium that's in everybody's homes, and we have the very first televised debates. And in those debates, even though he didn't know as much information as Nixon did, JFK looks relaxed, he looks young, he looks handsome. By contrast, Nixon is uncomfortable on camera, he's sweaty, and the American people look and say, well, yeah, Nixon might know some stuff, but this JFK looks like, you know, an energetic person that's going to lead us into the new decade here. And it's a very, very close election. And the results are that JFK wins by a tiny majority, just a few tens of thousands of votes nationwide. And in so doing, becomes the youngest president in American history up until Barack Obama in 2008. So he's very young. He also becomes the very first Catholic president. Every other president, all the way back to George Washington, were Protestants. And this was a big deal. I mean, it seems kind of an odd thing for us to worry about these days, but back in the day, that was a real big issue. Could a Catholic even become president? It was kind of like, could an African American become president before Barack Obama became president? That same kind of thing. But he is elected, and he puts together a cabinet of very young, very educated people called the best and brightest. A part of that is his brother, who is the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and he is really instrumental in trying to get through a lot of the president's policies. And then Robert McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense, who JFK knows from the Harvard days and will become really important when we start talking about Vietnam in a little while. So the programs that JFK institutes and puts into place as the president are called the New Frontier. So all of his processes and laws and programs put together are called the New Frontier. He really wants to kind of push the boundaries of what American government can do. He has domestic programs and then also some programs outside of that are more foreign based, but his domestic programs are really those classical liberal programs. He wants to make education better. He wants to add people to welfare to support the poor. He wants health care to be more accessible to people. He wants the older people in this country to be cared for. He wants to take crime out of the inner cities and allow them to flourish again. And it really is kind of a second coming of the New Deal. If we remember that from Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 30s and 40s, this is kind of a continuation of that. Social action, people getting involved with their government and the government helping them. So we're moving towards that progressive side again. We're moving towards that more socialism side of the political divide. But he has some problems. It's not all roses for him because he doesn't have really an opportunity to lead the way he wants to. While the Democrats are majority in Congress, it's a very small majority, kind of like the Republicans are today, and he can't get a lot of stuff through. He's battling Congress all the time. He barely won the presidency, so there's not a big mandate behind him. People aren't looking and saying, oh, wow, we really need to support this guy because he overwhelmingly won. He didn't. He barely won. And also his own party, which is made up of Southern Democrats from the southern states, which now would be Republicans, but back in the 1960s were Democrats, but very socially conservative Democrats, didn't like him and didn't support him, even though they were part of the same policy. He had very high inflation to deal with, so the economy wasn't going real well, and he had a number of different wars that started to come in and mess up his ability to institute these social programs. And that's going to be a concept that we're going to look at both with him and with Johnson. They had big ideas, and they had a hard time getting them through because of the realities. And most of his legislation would not pass because of these issues. One of the things that did happen in the 1960s, though, looking at another branch of government, was that the judicial system changes a little bit. And Chief Justice Warren is a conservative judge that's nominated by JFK, becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but goes through and kind of uses under his leadership, and you can see a picture of the Warren Court here, and you'll notice this is all white guys, right, with one exception, which is Thurgood Marshall. So, while it certainly does not represent the country, it moved to the left socially. So they really looked at a number of different ways where the judicial system could get involved socially in the United States, and we'll look at a couple of those right now. So some of their decisions, the court's decisions during the 1960s, are things that we look at right now. They're really looking at civil rights. So using the Constitution to protect people, protect citizens, oftentimes from their own government. Okay? So there's a few of these that will sound familiar to you. One in 1963 was called Gideon versus Wainwright. That the court found that you can't use evidence that is illegally gathered against somebody. So having a warrant, having permission to enter a car or enter a house or things like that has to be obtained before the police can come in and gather evidence. And without it, the court case can be thrown out. Another one that is really famous up to this day is called Miranda versus Arizona, and this is where the Miranda rights, or being Mirandized, comes from, if you've ever heard of those terms. And that's the concept of you have the right to remain silent, that anything said against or said by you can be used against you in a court of law, and you have a right to an attorney. Okay, so those kind of rights being spelled out to a suspect before they're arrested, so that they know that they don't have to say things without an attorney present. Ingle versus Vitale in 1962 essentially said that no prayer would be allowed in public schools. This is something that's constitutionally mandated in the First Amendment, but a lot of public schools still required prayer to be done every day, and this said you can't do that in a public school, only in a church-based school. And then Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965 overturns a ban on birth control and says that women do have a legal right to birth control if they choose. So a lot of different things. This is, again, none of these things seem really too exciting to us today, but these were huge back in the 1960s, huge decisions by this court. Also, JFK was different in his predecessor, Eisenhower, in terms of how he wanted to use and look at nuclear weapons. This is deep in the Cold War. This is very scary times. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about something in a minute where we got probably as close to nuclear war with the Soviet Union as we ever did, just a couple years down the line. And JFK recognizes that we can't just look at the idea of this massive retaliation. Eisenhower said, we're going to just build more of these nuclear weapons, and so the Soviet Union knows that if they attack us, we are just going to launch everything we have. That was called massive retaliation. Whereas JFK looked for something more called a flexible response, where he wanted to have the nuclear weapons in the arsenal, but recognized that we still needed to use conventional weapons, non-nuclear weapons, and the military to combat communism. And so that these wars, which would still be happening, these proxy wars, these hot wars within the Cold War, would be fought without nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons was essentially a one-shot deal and the world's done, and both we and the Soviet Union understood that. And he knew that the nuclear arsenal was not enough to protect the United States. We had to have a flexible response with other type of conventional military means. One of the programs that JFK did get through which is kind of a famous program that's attached to his presidency. It's called the Peace Corps, and this still exists today. This was really part of a larger call for Americans to volunteer, both for their government, for people outside of the U.S. It's good PR. It looks good for Americans to go and volunteer internationally. And what it said was that the government would pick up the tab if you would volunteer 2 years to spend in a developing nation. We really were looking for people that were specialized in education, agriculture, irrigation, healthcare, things like that, and that this would promote democracy and American influence. It would make America look good, and by us coming in contact with people around the world, they would be more likely to be kind of on our side than the Soviet Union side. So it was a base on volunteerism and help, but it also had some political needs too. And like I said, it's really one of the most lasting of the things that JFK ever did. One of the things that he's also famous for was the space race. So we saw that in the 1950s, the Russians were well ahead of us in the desire to get into space. They got the first man into space. They got the first satellite into space. We were behind. And so it was really a call to action by the president to make sure that we were going to jump ahead. And he did that by essentially very early in his presidency saying, we're going to go to the moon. We're going to do that within the 1960s, and at that point it was like us saying we're going to go to Saturn. It just was not something that was even a possibility at the time. A lot of the scientists looked and said, we don't know what the president's talking about. There's no hope we can do this. But it was really a call to action for the government, and obviously we did it. We made it in 1969 when we landed Apollo 11 on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first human to step on the surface of another astronomical body. Pretty cool stuff. So most of the 1960s were really dedicated to making some changes in space. One of the things that we also had happening in the 1960s was interaction with Cuba. Cuba was a country that was aligned to the United States up until about 1959, when a guy named Fidel Castro, who's pictured here, took over Cuba, and it became communist. Now, Cuba, if you look at a map, is really close to the United States. It's just 100 or so miles south of the United States, off the coast of Florida. And so having a communist country that was aligned to the Soviet Union that close to our borders was really scary for the United States. And we did a lot of things to try to stop Castro, to try to limit his influence. And one of those things was we invaded, or tried to invade, Cuba in something called the Bay of Pigs. This was a program that actually was initiated by President Eisenhower before he left office. It involved the CIA training Cubans that were living in the United States to go back and kind of retake over Cuba and make it a country that was connected to the United States again. And in 1961, JFK, as one of his very first foreign things that he does, approves this invasion. He hopes to start, the point of the invasion is to start a revolution by these Cubans that are going back, that the Cuban people will rise up, will fight off Castro, and it will now become a democratic country, or at least one that is connected with the United States again rather than the Soviet Union. Well, it's a total failure. It's awful. About 1,400 of these armed Cubans that are armed by the CIA get to or start this attack, this invasion. Many of them don't even make it to the island because they run aground on a coral reef. It's so bad that JFK cancels the air support by the American Air Force because he doesn't want America's involvement to be seen. He knows this is not going to work. So Castro captures and kills the rest of the poor Cuban exiles that are trying to come aground and start this invasion. And nobody rises up to fight Castro, and ultimately it's seen to be an American plot against him. It's a terrible, terrible piece of political relations for JFK.